Thank you so much for joining us. And to kick off our introduction, where do you want to share?
All right, well, thank you. And thank you all again for coming. I'm gonna cheat, use my. But thank you all again for coming here, and we do really appreciate your participation. This work is important. As obviously with our commissioners here and online listening, they're taking what they're hearing from you very seriously. So that's much appreciated. We're approaching a critical milestone here. So this is, I think, the 5th RAC meeting, and one more to go. And then you'll be crafting, well, maybe even starting tonight, crafting, so really what the recommendation is. So this is a big deal. But to clarify a few things, you know, if you've seen our vision statement, the new vision statement that we have everywhere here, we're taking that very seriously, and part of the work you're doing, it feeds right into that. And throughout this process, you guys have all been very thoughtful in the ways you've thought about supporting our financially vulnerable customers. And it's something that we take very seriously, we're really concerned about. And we want to be able to say, look, we really worked on this very hard, and you're going to be able to help us say that because all of the time you've put into this. So thank you very much for that. And then let's see here. So at the conclusion of the next provide your questions that will help commission turn the proposal. In fact, I think what was it today? We were going through, is it our March or April board meeting? I think what we would like is at least some of you, if not all of you, to be able to actually participate in that board meeting and have a spokesperson that could provide your recommendation to the board formally. So when we get to that point, so be thinking about that. So maybe there's somebody here who you want to say it's them, or maybe it's them. I don't know. So, but anyways, thank you again. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Paul Matthews. Me?
No. I have a little bit more, a few more instructions, and then thank you, Tom. Just wanted to make sure that we went over the agenda real quick. So this evening, as Tom spoke about, we're going to continue the conversation about rates, specifically talking about fixed and variable components, how the rates are structured, and we'll have a discussion about that, about customer experience, and we'll be looking for feedback from you after you hear a little bit more from our team about the different rate structures. And then we'll do a bit of a program preview about the assistance program. So the next meeting, the last meeting that's coming up, will focus on the assistance program review and making a recommendation. And we'll have a little bit of time if there are any members of the public to take the end of the meeting. Jenna, do you want to take a moment to just talk about virtual participation?
Great, thanks so much. Yes, everyone, along the top of your toolbar, there are options for entering comments in the chat. You can also raise your hand, and I can insert, I can open the mic and let folks in the room know that you'd like to comment on the record. There are also options under the 3 dots that say more. It's next to your camera button. And there you're able to adjust your audio settings under the settings and device settings tab, as well as under language and speech. You can turn on live captioning that can aid in your ability to track what's happening in the room. Please let me know at any time through the chat if you need any assistance. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jenna. So as Tom mentioned, this is the 5th meeting. We have one more coming up in March. And we want to make sure that you recognize all the hard work and the time commitment you all put in. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this process. Your contributions are really important to the process of your communities. Thank you so much. And we are almost there. So now we will hand it off to Paul.
All right.
We'll talk about the volume.
We have a motion or a vote after?
You can just tell me and I'll.
All right. So you might remember last time we got together, had a 20-minute presentation, had 10 minutes to give it, so I sped through there very quickly. Tonight I have a 5-minute presentation. I'm going to take 10 minutes to give it because I love talking about this topic, but in all seriousness, slow me down if you have questions because we really want to give you an opportunity to ask questions about the material I covered last time. And again, we just wanted to go through things a little bit fast because we're running short of time. Tonight's time to answer questions. So our discussion tonight, I am going to briefly talk about cost service principles, but again, if you have questions about that, please ask them. The rate setting history at TVWD and how we got to where we are, that walk down memory lane for us, and current calculations of our customer bills. Next slide, please. So at TVWD, our rates are based on what we call cost of service principles. So these are industry standard principles that allow us to calculate the customer bills in such a way that the bill itself is in proportion to the cost of serving those customers. So that's the idea of trying to set rates so that the bills, when they're presented to a customer, are in proportion to the cost of serving them. Some of our customers take a lot of water at a more constant rate. They're cheaper to serve on a per unit basis. Their average costs a little bit less. Other customers, like my family, takes a lot more in the summer. We need to have those facilities around all year for them to use during that peak month. And so the cost of providing service to my family is a little bit higher than it is for other customers. And as a result, I can tell you my bill is a little bit higher and the average cost of water for me is similarly a little bit higher. So we try to calculate those bills to recover the cost of serving a customer. The other thing is that it recognizes that the cost of serving customers, it is based on when customers use the water, because for us, we size up the system to meet those peak demands, but they're only used largely for those peak periods. So we're looking at peak season, peak day, and peak hour cost, and of course, fire cost, another important part. The other part of our cost service principles is when new customers come to the system and join growth. And so we have something called a system development charge, where new customers pay a one-time capital charge when they connect to the system that offsets the cost of growth. So we don't have our existing customers subsidizing future customers. We use the SDCs to do that, system development charges. So overriding principles, industry standard approaches. We follow the standards of the American Water Works Association. There are a lot of standards out there. That's largely what we use. It avoids subsidies among customer classes. And the last item is we put fair in quotes, because in this context, fair is defined as paying proportional to the cost of serving customers. It's not everybody's definition of fairness per se, but it is the definition of fairness of cost of service water. Maintaining the proportion of cost of the system. Go to the next slide, please. So here's the walk down memory lane. And so TVWD's rate structure is what we call an excess use rate structure. That is that for our customers, you pay a higher amount for water over a fixed threshold, an inclining block rate structure, but you do that in such a way that the average cost of your water ties back to that cost of service. So in 1990s, we put in an excess use rate structure here at the district. The threshold over which that first block was very large, very large. In fact, it was so large that very few customers had much consumption within that second block at all. In 2004, we lowered that monthly threshold and we retuned the calculations so that we would reflect the cost of services I described. So that average cost of your water reflected the cost of providing the service. But it was designed to encourage conservation, was the largest reason for that. And at that time, the district was going through, we were having growth, water demands were increasing, and we were looking at that next source of supply. Was that going to be the Willamette? We didn't know. Was it going to be the Joint Water Commission expanding the reservoir at Tag Lake. It's going to be something else. So we were able to buy time by getting conservation out of our customers and delaying the need for that major capital improvement. And that let us essentially prepare better for the big project that we're involved with right now. So that was the focus in 2004, conservation and giving us a little bit of time. In 2012, by that time, we knew we were going to be doing this new water supply project fairly quickly. We didn't know which one, but we knew it was going to happen within the time frame in the next, well, until 2026, because we were just negotiating our contract with Portland. So we knew that we were going to be moving in that direction. We knew that our costs were going to become, we were going to have a huge debt component to our future cost structure, and we started to prepare ourselves financially for that future. And at that time, we moved some of the fire protection cost out of the volume rate, and we put it into the fixed charge. And that did a couple things. First, whether you use water or not, you still have to provide fire protection to your property. So it was in keeping with cost of service principle. We protect your property, whether you use much water or not. The second thing is it increased the revenue stability for the district. It increased that percentage of revenue that we got from the fixed charges versus the volume charges. So that was in 2012. In 2016, 17, we went through a rate advisory committee process, very similar to the one that we're doing here tonight. And the goal of that was to work on affordability, was to work on the affordability of water for our customers, because we knew that the water rates were going to be going up at a rate that was going to leave more of our customers behind. That was a concern for the policymakers. How are we going to be able to build this project, finance it, fund it, without injuring some of the most vulnerable customers? That was the focus of the 2017. Now, when we did that, it wasn't focused on affordability, but we did look at the block rates and we did look at the block thresholds, and we confirmed that those were still relevant for the district and that we were in alignment with cost of service principles. And that brings us to where we are tonight, where we're now at the point where we're wanting to make those changes to our customer assistance program to help those customers and the other things that we've asked the rate advisory committee to work with us on. So I want to pause just for a moment, see if there are any questions about our history or our rate design. I've got just a few more. Yes,
Could you go back one slide? I just have one quick question.
you bet.
What subsidy among classes? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's one of the, we have different measures of what we call equity criteria and rate setting. One of them is among classes, between classes. So residential customers are paying their fair share versus commercial versus multifamily versus industrial customers. The other measure is intra-class within the customers, that same kind of residential customers, that this one isn't being subsidized by the other one. And then we have our intergenerational equity, which is what the SDCs do. So new customers are paying their fair share, and existing customers aren't subsidizing them. So when we're talking about this avoid subsidies among classes, we're really saying that we're not having the commercial class be subsidized by the residential class or something like that. Any other questions on this?
I have a question about, I'm assuming in 2017, when you had the RAC, that you knew what the cost of the system was going to be, or what the proposed costs were.
Good estimates, yeah.
So did you sort of march out what that increase was going to look like over a certain period of time?
Yeah. Yeah, so we did. And at that time, we assumed that the rates were going to be actually about where we're ending up. Now, we managed to get some real cost savings in how we financed the program,
Right.
but then we had this recent bout of inflation, which ate up a lot of those benefits. But yeah, we had forecasted that time, I think the rate forecast for that typical customer, which is 700 cubic feet of water, is the most common bill we issue per customer. So that was going to be about 105 a month. Now we're somewhere in that range between 95 and 105, depending on what happens over the next several years.
And you signaled all of that to your customer base, what that plan
Yeah,
is.
we've been,
Yeah, got it.
we thought we had hit a reprieve until a few years ago. And didn't.
Had you been considering affordability from 204 all the way until 17 and 2020?
I think our board has always been concerned about affordability. That's always been a concern. And in fact, in 2004, part of the conservation rate design was also intended to help customers who use very little water to give them more control over their bill. So yes, that was part of it. But so is conservation. Because again, it was important for us to manage that resource to keep the overall costs low, so we could focus on that longer term supply project, buy a little bit more time before we had to build it out. So it has never not been a concern of the board, but it has become more of a concern. I should let the board members speak for themselves, but I think it's fair to say that it's become more of an issue in 2012 when we had an idea of what this was going to cost. We started to run those analysis and said, well, there are going to be an increasing number of customers that won't be able to pay these kinds of rates.
Yeah, another question is conservation factored in throughout the years in some form or another?
Yes, so as best we can. We do, when we do our forecast, we do two different forecasts. We have our engineers to do a forecast because for an engineer to be conservative means not to undersize something and come back and have to dig up a 12-inch pipe, replace a 16-inch pipe. So they have one set of criteria. So we do that kind of forecast. But then on the finance side, we do another forecast because the nightmare for us would be to assume that we're going to get, 75 million, only get 70 million. So in our forecast, we have, when we do the financial, the revenue forecast, we do take that into account. We've seen a decline in the gallons per capita per day. I think we talked about that previously. And we've seen demand harden. So, we have seen it come down. I will say though, that not as much as we had thought. So demand is a little bit stronger. I suspect that this is just my opinion based on reading articles in the newspaper, which you all can read as well as I can. I think that as we pass through COVID now, we're starting to see things like default rates on car loans going up, that maybe we're going to see more of an impact, a price-induced effect of on conservation. But we've been planning for that as well. But it's very difficult to know how customers are going to react. It's very difficult to know which customers you're going to have in the future, how much growth is there going to be. Some other things changed. City of Beaverton had withdrawn some customers, things like that we had to retool our plan based on. Yes.
Have you seen a change? I know COVID and commercial usage has gone down. Has it stayed down or has that gone back up?
It's recovered somewhat, but not as much as it hasn't recovered as much as before the pandemic. But what we have seen is really strong performance from our industrial customers. And so they're outperforming the pre-pandemic. That can change as the economy goes through its cycles. So we're concerned about that. Commercial hasn't popped back quite as much. But we've seen basically multifamily and single family are back to pre-pandemic levels, and same with irrigation, which is driven largely by the weather. But today we're not going to get a lot of water to irrigate. And it's unfortunate because we have a lot of water ourselves. Any other questions? Okay, why don't we go to the next slide? So the other thing, and click one more time so we get the graphic up. Thank you. So you've seen this graph before, and this is essentially the topic that we wanted to talk to you about tonight. I'm going to sit down and let Jason pick up and talk about what his analysis shows. But just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land here. I'm going to start with the definition of fixed cost. So fixed costs, sometimes people assume fixed costs are costs that don't change. That's not what fixed costs are. Fixed costs are costs that do not vary with the amount of water we sell. They change. So our fixed cost can be capital improvements. Our fixed cost labor is a fixed cost. Doesn't matter how much water we sell generally, the amount of labor we have is driven by how many pipes we have to maintain, how many meters we have to read, how many bills we need to send out. It's not necessarily how much water we sell. So those are the fixed costs. Variable costs are those costs that vary with the amount of water we sell. So that's largely pumping power, chemicals, and some of our purchased water costs, although our contract with Portland, a lot of this actually fixed. The graph that you see here shows our fixed cost as compared to our revenue. I want to warn you not to jump to conclusions that this means that we're crazy people. It doesn't indicate that at all. This is pretty common that for utilities, especially water utilities, for the most capital intensive utilities, and utilities are the most capital intensive business that we have. So 91% of our costs are fixed, 8.1% of our costs are variable. What that means is that we spend a lot of money on things that don't vary with the amount of water that we sell. Our contract with Portland, we're obliged to pay them for 13.16 MGD of water, whether we take it or not, that's actually a fixed cost. So we have a lot of costs that fit in that category. On the revenue side, the fixed charges are those fixed mostly by monthly charges. We go most of our customers every 2 months. That's a fixed part of the bill for reading meters, so it's cost of reading meters, for providing that customer service, for maintaining the meters and the services, and that fire protection I talked about that we added back in the fixed charges back in 2012. So those are the things that are in the fixed charges. The volume charges are based on how much water you're using in the system. So a lot of the fixed costs that are related to the size of our facilities, the peaking that we have reservoirs, meet those peak season demands, those peak day demands, those peak hour demands. Those things are recovered in the volume-based revenue as well. Yeah.
So the 91, excuse me, the 91.9% that's today?
It varies,
Right.
but the 91.9%, I think I calculated a few years ago.
Okay, so looking forward, when we finish this project, and the amount of our fixed costs are now tied to making payments, how much does that change, if at all?
Well, because it's going to cut both ways, Tom, so that's a good question. So things that will be fixed cost nature will be the debt service. Things that will no longer, but that's going to be offset by the amount we're paying for. So that will be partly offset. But we are going to have more pumping costs and more chemical costs because we're going to be operating a treatment plant. We'll be charged on a per unit basis for that. So that will increase our variable charge. Right now with Portland, the way the contract works, those costs that might otherwise be variable are end up showing as a fixed cost. So it's an interesting thought experiment. It sounds like I've got some math to do.
I'm trying to make the point to understand that, and it's the concern I have is as I look forward, we've got a large fixed cost tied to paying off the project, right? And a big portion of my cost is tied to this variable concept. So it's a little unnerving.
Yeah, but I wouldn't worry too much, Tom, because I think we're going to probably end up the same place. Because what we've been doing is building up, we've been setting rates to recover amount of cost that we're investing in the capital project right now. And that essentially, by the time we're done with this program of getting the revenues in place, that will just pivot over. Instead of being spent on capital improvements, it'll be spent on debt service. So the overall amount might not vary that much.
I think we can sort of assume that your fixed costs as we're going forward are going to be less volatile.
No, they're really not that volatile on the cost side. The cost structure, it doesn't vary as much as you might think because again, only about 8% of it is variable cost. And so if that went up by 10%, you're not going to see that 0.8%, right?
Can you give us a sense of how much that variable revenue can change year to year based on weather?
Yeah. So, so put it this way. We target to get about $75 to $80 million. We can have a variance of $2 to $5 million in a year. Just to kind of give you a rough number. Yeah. No, this isn't unique to TVW. Oh, yeah.
Debt service in 30 years?
Well, it depends. So the WIFI loan will be 35 years, but it will start at the point, we'll start repaying that in 2028. So that's one of the terms of that loan. So it allows us to defer payment. And at a 1.35% interest rate, what we're doing right now is we're taking as much money as we can and we're reinvesting that at 4.5%. And so we'll do that until the end of until they won't let us do it anymore when it's all taken down. But I don't know if I got your question there or not. 35 years. The revenue bonds that we're gonna need some supplemental financing. those will probably be somewhere with an average of 25, maybe 30 years. Depending on the market where it is.
About 35 years to pay after that.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll probably wrap some of the debt, so we'll structure it in a way to be to the advantage of repayment. So, but yeah, 30 to, it'll depend on the market, frankly, but I would say anywhere 25 years would probably be the average bond life of the last issue that we do. So this is a pretty common arrangement for utilities to have this kind of a cost structure. And so utilities have developed techniques of living in this kind of an environment, as have we. So what have we done to live in a world with fixed cost and variable revenues? Well, one is we have, within our bond covenants, we have a rate stabilization account, which allows us to set money aside in a rainy day fund and be able to use that without affecting our financial performance negatively and our creditworthiness. We keep reserve balances. And boy, when you get that extra $2.5 to $5 million a year, that offsets some of your costs as well. So we have mitigations. We have ways that we've dealt with this. Go to the next slide. So here's the typical customer bill. And when I say typical customer, this is the most common bill we issue. 700 cubic feet of water, we know that's about 5,200 gallons. Again, it's kind of an abstract number. But what we have there is that typical customer in 2022, about $70.46 total bill. And you can see the breakout there. About 30% of their bill is fixed, and 69%, 70% of it is based on the volume charges. So wait a minute, Paul, you just said we've got this 80-20. What's with this 70-30 stuff? And the point is that based on how much water you're getting, based on the size that you are, the relative percentage your fixes to your variables is going to matter. It's going to matter a lot. So in this case, the typical customer has the typical bill, about 30% of it being fixed for that 7 CCF. Obviously, there are some customers, large ones, who they just have 1 meter. It's not very expensive to read it. It's not very expensive to maintain it. And we put their fire protection cost in there for sure, but they take a lot more water. And so that fixed cost as a percentage of their total bill is down. That weighted average comes in at that 80-20. So I just thought that was interesting for you all to see there. We go to the next slide, and I think that is just it for me. Is there any other questions?
Do the costs go up according to the demand, I guess? There's a lot of building going around, and more people are using power. Does that necessarily mean that the more you use, the cheaper it might be?
Yeah, so a couple reasons why. One is that we charge a system development charge for them. So they would help pay for the capital project through their SDC. And then we would get economies of scale out of that. So yeah, so if we have growth in our customer base, it would help. Definitely would help. But the way land use works and everything else, we are closing in on there's not as much growth in our future. In fact, our financial forecast takes into account that we're going to see a diminishment in growth and system development charges. Yeah, Tom, do you want to add something?
And not to contradict at all. But we are looking to serve other entities and to broaden our customer base. So we're working on our relationship with Beaverton and seeing if we couldn't provide more service there to both help them and us. Frankly, in the long term, it reduces everybody's costs when we all chip in together. The bigger we make the pie, the better off we can be. But we're also in discussions with like Cornelius, Banks, what's the one next to Banks there? I'm forgetting.
North Plains.
So we're in those kinds of conversations to see, how can we help provide service? What can we do to help expand our customer base, not necessarily through growth, in the traditional sense, but more in the sense of just expanding the customer base.
And we can do that, and we have done that fact. So we read all the meters in the city of Beaverton, even for those that are the Beaverton city customers. And we bill the wastewater with clean water services. So by doing that, we're able to get, again, those economies of scale. And that efficiency then helps both parties. It helps Beaverton because they don't have to stand up a meter reading crowd. It helps us because we're able to get that economies of scale out of our supervision and oversight. So there are win-wins out there, and there can be more. And obviously, we want to pursue those.
I was going to comment, we're not in a desperate situation. I lived in the state of Nevada where they paid us, so to speak, not to use water. Economize, conserve. If you go to Vegas, for example, you don't see many lawns. The opposite here. You see a lot of lawns, a lot of vegetation, everything else, but it's Oregon. So, and we have more water in Nevada. But that's where I'm coming from in terms of conservation. No matter whether we have too much or enough and not having enough, and what we're doing to still conserve.
I think it's fair to say that, so conservation is important, I think, of the district. It's one of our values to be good stewards, and that hasn't changed. But I think it's fair to say that, notwithstanding that the impact of having additional water sales to the district is going to be reduced because we aren't up against that. We're going to do a big expansion. We're going to have a lot of capacity. And so at that point, it'll be using that capacity to generate revenue will be relatively beneficial to our customers. Whereas in 2004, we wanted to delay so we could get our financial legs under us for a big investment. So, yeah, but we're not in Nevada. But with climate change, we don't know how that is going to work out. And that's, again, one of the reasons Dave Kraske could tell you this if he were here tonight, that we went with the Willamette. It's much more resilient from a climate change perspective. Yeah. Anything else? Tom, did we hit that one? Okay, want to make sure we got that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer of putting biases. Oops, it's okay.
I use that all the time.
But I'm a big believer in putting bias on the table, and I'll put my bias on the table, and that is, right now, again, what I was saying before, I'm a little nervous. Paul keeps telling me you're gonna be fine, Tom. But I'm a little more nervous just about these fixed costs that we're facing they're gonna be more fixed, right? I can't shed debt. Once I've acquired it, it's mine, and we're gonna own it for a long time. And that variability component makes me a little more nervous. And so my bias is, God, I'd like to see that change a little bit. But that's why you're all here. It's why we have a board. I get to express as the CEO, that's my concern, but I get to live with that concern. I get to deal with it. So, but this is where you can help provide us what you also think.
I just want to see for folks online, if anyone online has a question. If so, feel free to unmute. I just wanted to pause in the room for a moment.
Thanks, Jen.
Anyone online? Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry to insert.
Okay.
One of the handouts tonight was kind of mentioned something about volatility in the revenue, which I think where this conversation's headed. So you're kind of apt to have a better segue of fixed cost to fixed revenue. Can you just kind of briefly skip the all sense of is the revenue been that volatile the last 3 years or since?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is we had a wet summer before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember that, but nobody was selling much water, including region-wide. So that brought our revenues down. We were off by about 7 million that year. I'm doing that from memory. I can get the real numbers. Then we had the pandemic that hit commercial customers. That was more of a business risk as opposed to a weather event, but that occurred. But this biennium, we are actually above our target right now. And so it can be plus and minus. A few years ago, we had a bang up year. We were about $8 million over. Oh, over that biennium, not that year, but the biennium. And of course, that then offset and delayed when we had to borrow more money for the program, because that money went right to the capital projects. We're able to put that right to work on the capital project, which is, of course, Google Lemon. Yeah. If there are no other questions, I will sit down. Said I had a 5-minute presentation. It was going to take 10. I think it's a little longer. Jason, do you want to take over? Let's see.
Great. There's a couple of questions that we wanted to pose before we start talking about how this really works. One is customer considerations. So what are the impacts on customer experience? Should the district consider, as it ponders this question of whether to move the rate structure around? And secondly, we're looking for your input here. Should the district change its rate structure so it can recover more of its costs from these fixed charges than it currently does? For one, what is the customer impact of this? Two, that's really something that the district ought to be doing. And I think it's important that we talk about ways that the district and all other utilities in the country really manage this risk. One way to do it is through the rate structuring, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Basically, what that looks like is just what we're going to show you here in a minute. We increase the amount that is being recovered in that cost of service rate structure from a volumetric component and more towards a fixed monthly service charge component. That's one way to do it. What happens then is we simply recover less revenue from that usage side of the business. We cover more from those fixed monthly charges. Pretty simple, straightforward, nothing complicated about it. And what we're going to really talk about here is that in those cases that Paul was just talking about, those really wet years where demand was way lower than we would have expected it, the district would lose less money than what Paul just went over in the case where we have those higher fixed charges. That's really the whole point in this. And we're going to show you an example of that here in just a minute. But there are other methods for handling this, and all of these are things that the district is also doing. Reserve balances, this is just extra cash on hand to deal with those fluctuations in demand. Depending on where you live and how big these fluctuations can be. In my part of the country, I live in Colorado, we get huge fluctuations in demand. A wet year is just as bad as a really dry year for us. We lose revenue either way. So having a lot of cash on hand helps absorb those revenue shifts so that we don't have to go out to the ratepayers immediately and say, hey, we've got to get more money from you. We got to do more here. We can absorb that. We call this rate stabilization funds. They have all kinds of different names, but what it really amounts to is district or a utility keeping more cash on hand so they can deal with those fluctuations and continue to sustain their operations regardless of whether those fluctuations are occurring or not. And the other one is just the frequency at which we're doing financial planning, the utility is doing financial planning and rate making. So if you're seeing these fluctuations that are becoming a bigger part of your operation, as you go and look at this frequently, like say every year, you can make those adjustments incremental over time. And just like this district has done throughout its history, it's sort of re-examining this on an ongoing basis, making those changes and adapting to the environment. So a couple of other ways in which this is done and can be done here and elsewhere. So if we wanted to do this, and we're going to pose a hypothetical here, Paul says that about 20% of our revenue right now comes from these fixed charges. We're going to pose a hypothetical to increase that to 30%. So you can kind of use a working example here about how this might work. You really need to do two things in that instance. One is, we're going to increase the monthly charges. The left chart over here shows what the average impact of that would be for customers in the district. And I've got a series of years here, historical ones, So you can take a look at what that might have looked like in the past. Basically, we need to increase those fixed charges by about 35% in order to get to where we want to go with that. And you can kind of see what that would have done in the past with the chart. So the dark blue or the darker colored blocks there, those are what the actual charges would have been in those historical years. And the light green is what they would be if we wanted to get to 30% of that revenue. But the thing that we also need to consider is when Paul was talking about how cost of service rate making works, is we do build public utility rates based on the costs that are incurred to provide the service. This is not a profit-making enterprise. This isn't someplace where we go to earn a bunch of margins and make a bunch of money for our shareholders. It exists for the benefit of the community, and so it's provided at cost. So if we're going to do that at cost and we're going to raise one part of the rate structure up by 35%, we've got to make adjustments on the other part of the rate structure so that we can maintain revenue neutrality. And when we say revenue neutrality, we really mean cost neutrality here. So we're going to recover the same amount of money under the approach that we're taking. What that means is the volumetric rate actually has to come down if we're going to be revenue neutral out of all that. All right, so that's going to come down by about 10% under these under this hypothetical. Now, we have a rate structure out there. Paul described it very well. It's an excess use rate. You have different blocks. There's some complication there. What we've done to try to simplify that for you is we've reduced it all to an average per unit, average cost per unit of usage. So it blends all of that rate structuring together just for the sake of this example. But if you can imagine it this way, if you looked at your rate structure across the board, all elements of the volumetric rates would come down by 10%, and all elements of the fixed charges would go up by 35%, and you would reach this revenue neutrality. So why aren't those numbers equal? Well, because we have a lot in that usage side. So the number of units we're talking about there is quite a bit more than the number of meters that we have installed here. That means we get more revenue in total from the usage. Makes sense to everybody? So so in order to be revenue neutral, we can't just increase the fixed charges and forget about the volume charges. We actually have to adjust both. Go.
Quick questions. On rate setting, what are the options for the water district in terms of when they change rates? Is it annual, quarterly? Who sets whether you can change your rates? Is it the Public Utility Commission or something?
Do you want to answer it? Go ahead.
Sure. So it's actually the board. So the way that we're regulated, so because we're a utility or a natural monopoly, we need some form of regulation. We're not regulated like the by a PUC like PGE or Northwest Natural.
Yeah.
We're regulated by our elected officials. And so ultimately, they're the ones that make the decision on how much the rates and how often we will look at them. The district's practice since the rate advisory committee recommendation was to set rates on a 2-year basis. So we've been setting rates on a 2-year basis, but we do our financial planning more frequently than that, like very frequently actually, to see where we are. And so last year we actually did a mid-course adjustment, and with the board's approval, that's what we will do. We're heading into our cycle for a 2-year. We're finishing our biennial budget, so we'll project rates out for 2 years. We will present that to the board since that's consistent with their past policies, and ultimately they'll make a decision as to whether or not they want to adopt 2-year rate increases, how frequently they want to do it, what that rate increase will be. Yeah, there is thank you, Andrew. There is a process prescribed by law, but it's actually pretty flexible. It requires that we notify customers. As a special district, unlike a city, we actually have to notify the customers in advance. We do that by sending a postcard out to the customers. But otherwise, the process is open to the judgment of our board. They've directed us in the past to have open houses and engage the public in conversation. They've directed us to have this kind of thing as well, and I suspect it would give us the same direction in the future.
So if we went down this route and we increased the fixed charges by about 35%, we decreased the volumetric charges by about 10%, and we get revenue neutral that way, what does it do for us? What does it do for the district? Well, one of the things to keep in mind is that we're really only going to be very concerned about the rate structure in the instance where demand is a lot lower than we expect it to be. So when we do rate planning, we have sort of this nice straight line of where we expect our demand to be 1 year to the next. We've got growth factored in there. We're looking at some kind of normalized usage to get us to a base point. And then we're looking at growth, and it's very nice. It's got this very nice straight slope to it. It looks just like my arm right now. And then, of course, reality kicks in, and it's not like that at all. So when Paul was giving you some of those examples in those years where they had, good years, that was when demand was up and we sold more water than we were expecting. It was above this line here. In the years where it was low, then demand was down here, somewhere where we didn't expect it to be. What the change in fixed charges really do for you is they help hedge against those low years. When demand isn't where you expect it to be, usage isn't where you expect it to be, you don't get as much money from those usage charges as you were hoping or thinking that you were going to. So what I tried to do here is to try to show you, like, how much improvement would you expect in terms of revenue recovery during times when that demand is lower than you expect it to be. Again, we're not too concerned about when demand is higher than expected because we're just going to get more money at that point. So let me familiarize you with the chart here. I've got the two bars there represent two different scenarios. Dark bars are when demand would be 10% lower, and the lighter bars are when demand is 20% lower. And then what we've got on the axes right here is the increase in total revenue that the district would see in those scenarios by raising the fixed charges up to that 30% level that we were talking about before. So the horizontal axis implicitly is the point where we are today, the structure that we have today. So what the graph is showing you is the improvement in revenue collection in those future scenarios versus where we're at today. And what it shows is that, for a 10% decrease in demand, we're somewhere underneath a 1% improvement in revenue recovery. When demand is down by 20% or more, it's something just under 2%. It's a pretty linear trend at that point forward. So you can imagine the improvement goes up just about 1% for every 10% decrease in demand. Put the table over there in the bottom right to show you the kind of numbers that you're looking at. What does 1% of revenue look like versus what does 2% of revenue look like? And it kind of gives you a sense for how much more money the district would be bringing in those situations. So basically, the district would expect to recover more revenue during those downturns in demand than it does today because we're going to get more money from those fixed charges in that scenario than we are today. It's just a little bit more in those downturns though. So at 30% of fixed charges of revenue recovery, revenue recovery is improved about 1% for every 10% decrease in demand. So it's not totally immaterial, but probably not as much as most people might have been thinking. Right? Go next. And here's the impact on the customers. So let's walk through this a little bit. There's a lot on here. Up here in the top left corner, we see the block rates, right? So block rate before in the top row there, 703 and 1002. If we decrease those by 10%, we get to the after there. That's what those rates would be. On the fixed side for a 5/8 inch meter, we're going to increase those as I said. We're going to go from 21 to 2843 for this residential customer. And then here is what that monthly impact would look like at different levels of usage. So we've got a low usage customer here at 4 CCF, an average user at 7, and a high user that we just plugged in there at 20 CCF to give you a sense of that. So for that low usage user, whose bill is sort of currently right around $50 a month, it's going to be 9% increase in their bill. Why is that? Well, because that's what we would expect, We're going to increase the fixed charge. That becomes a very big part of their bill because they're only using 4 CCF. We're going to decrease the volume charge, and in the end, that increases their bill 9%. Now, you know, it is 9%, but if you can kind of tell the scale here, we're talking about just a few bucks difference there. Okay. The 7 CCF customer is pretty close to even, but it is plus 3%. And then this is something that you're going to see, especially when we get to the next panel here. We're going to be talking about commercial customers, but the higher your usage is, the more that 5% is going to be a bigger number, right? So because that fixed charge becomes a smaller and smaller component of your total bill, and because we're decreasing those usage charges, we will see that higher use customers actually end up saving money under this kind of an approach. So here's a few bullet points to keep in mind. Those lowest volume customers, they're going to experience the biggest impact from this. That's true no matter what class we're talking about, but it's going to be more true on the residential class because they're the ones who are going to be at these very low usage levels relative to other customers. Like 4 CCF, 5 CCF, that's pretty common with residential customers, not very common with commercial customers. The higher the monthly volume, the more a residential customer would benefit or save from this. Discretionary water use at very high levels, that becomes cheaper. And so you have to wonder whether conservation is actually being achieved at that level. So if there is a certain price signal that's being sent there that you need to be aware of. It's potentially difficult to overcome relative to the affordability discussion. So I wanted to bring this back for just a minute because the conversation we've already had with you about affordability, and particularly, I think, this situation here. So that really does increase the burden on these low-use customers, and whatever numbers that we've been talking about and program sizing that we've been talking about, that all would have to adjust as a result of this as well. So just something for you to keep in mind. I'm not trying to dissuade you one way or another, but this is about having all the information you need to make good decisions and good recommendations.
Is this bi-monthly? This is based.
It's monthly.
Based on billing or based on monthly?
It's monthly. Thank you. All right, let's take a look at commercial customers. I think this will be eye-opening. We have a lot of the same, we have the same block structure. There are different block thresholds involved. We have different fixed charges. I'm going to use a 2-inch meter here because that's pretty common with commercial customers. But again, you'll kind of find the same kind of trend here is that the higher the usage for a customer is, the more that customer will sort of benefit from this kind of shift. Again, fixed charges are a small part of the commercial bills, so they tend to benefit because a lot of their bills based on volume charges, and we're decreasing the volume rate. Industrial users at the very high usage level are going to benefit the most. Some conservation issues, the same as with the residential side. And, you know, some of these effects could be mitigated with some different class-based rate structures. So this is all saying that we're going to make these changes across the board with the rate structure that we currently have. There is the possibility that you go in, you redo your cost of service, you come up with different rate structure altogether for different classes of customers, so that you can maybe try to address some of this, these reductions in bills that we're talking about here. And that might need to be done actually, you know, as you go to this approach. So let's, so here's the discussion. I think this is where you guys wanted to take over, isn't it? So I don't want to steal your thunder. Okay, go ahead.
We wanted to take this time to have a conversation, discuss what is the customer experience, or what are the impacts on the customer experience that the commissioners and decision makers should consider. And everything is happy to take yours. So we can keep track of what everyone says. So, and then we'll check in, Jenna, on any online comments. So, I'll check in every other question or every other comment if there's anyone on the virtual or group that would like to share.
Great, thank you.
Can I offer one piece in all of this so right now, we've been having conversations with the large industrial users. And they're looking at the current rates and where they're going. And their normal reaction, as any business, is, I'm going to reduce usage. What that does, if they carry out on that, that raises everybody's rates. Everybody else goes up. And they have the most flexibility in terms of financial capability to actually go implement a lot of conservation measures to reduce that. Think of Nike, they can easily go and remove a whole bunch of turf. Maybe that's the right thing to do. But the more their peak use goes down, the more then when we adjust rates the following year, everybody else's rates go up. So that's one of those kind of trade-offs. That's not an obvious trade-off that you're kind of making here when you're talking about this fixed versus variable. And my concern right now is because we are hearing from the large corporations saying, well, we're going to implement some, pretty strong conservation measures. And part of me is like, great, you should do that. And then I turn around and think about, wait a minute, this is going to hurt all the rest of our customers if you do. So just food for thought.
Well, my concern is that we're dealing with inflation in whatever fashion you want to look at. But having water in your spigot is not an option, so to speak. So I have to consider that. So my thoughts would be, how do you measure the aspect of inflation where people have to pay more for living, whether it's groceries, whether it's a car loan, whatever it is, and still afford the water. In other words, if you're paying more for all these other commodities and products, you don't have a choice with water. So I think inflation would be a very important one to think about how you factor all that in.
Jenna, are there any comments online?
I'll open it for folks to unmute. If anyone online has a question or would like to make a comment, please feel free to unmute. And again, we're hopeful for feedback on how customers might be impacted if the district were to increase its recovery through fixed charge and reduce the volume. Okay, we'll come back to the online folks in a little bit. Thanks, Katie.
What else? What else?
I actually have one specific question. I'm looking at slide 15. I'm trying to understand the change between before and after. If I took just 2 years, I looked at 2022, and I'm probably not understanding this slide. So if I looked at the after fixed and the after variable and added them up, and then was to divide them by the before fixed and variable, I'm coming up with a different percent than something I've seen. Maybe I'm thinking about that wrong, but.
You're talking about this time?
Yeah. So if you add up 2000, pick one, whatever, doesn't matter. 2022, you took before the 23.16 and the $6.11, compared that to 30.97 and 5.51. That increase, if that's an appropriate way to look at it, I could be wrong, so you guys correct me. I mean, I'm calculating that's like a 29 or a 23% swing on a monthly basis. So I'm taking, and we could pick a year, but let's just take 2021. So if I pick up the dollars month before, fixed is 21.32, and then the variable is 5.75, right?
That's the average.
Yeah, am I right? Do you add those together?
No, you wouldn't.
No?
No, the 575 on the right-hand side, that's the average per volume charge. So you'd have to multiply that against the.
So he's making the assumption, assume 1 CCF is used.
Right.
Oh, 1 CCF?
Yeah.
So in that sense, he's correct.
Yeah, okay, 1 CCF.
So the way I calculate that, that's a 29% increase in 2020.
If you had a 1.
23% just on one, just the unit. And it's 23% in 2022. But you guys are the experts. I'm just trying to be slides.
I'm not sure what you're,
Take 2020.
513 to 575, that's 10%.
No, but he's saying take 2132 plus 575.
Mhm.
Okay, that's one total. Take 2974 to 513, and that total, take those two totals, the difference between those two
Yeah.
totals is 23%. That's what he's saying.
Sure.
Yeah,
One example. So I don't,
So to go forward to slide, yeah, this slide 17. You're now saying that it's only 9%.
That's for 4 CCF, not 1.
CCF.
So so he's using 1 CCF.
1 CCF is worst case scenario.
Yes.
but I think it's.
Yeah, no, if
You're
somebody's
right.
using 1 or 2 CCF per month, they would see the largest increase.
Yeah.
On a modeling it, but anyhow, so not to nitpick.
Yeah. I think your math is right, though. It just wasn't one of the examples that Jason presented.
Paul, we had a little trouble hearing what was said. Are you saying that the less by volume you use under the potential change, the more you would pay in your bill than from today's current structure?
As a percentage, yes. So you would see a larger impact on your bill if you had 1 CCF, and if you had 2. You'd see a larger impact on your bill if you had 2 rather than 3, and so on. Up the line.
Yeah, can you go back to what we were just looking at? So if there's questions about this, I want to make sure that this gets understood because it's extremely important. One more. Sorry, not that one.
17.
Right. If you go down to the left-hand corner there, the bottom, and you see that low usage, that's a 4 CCF usage level right there. And that's plus 9%. And as you go up from there to the right, you see that the impact on the bill changes. Basically, the more water you're using, the more of a benefit that you're getting from this. So it's also true in the opposite direction. If we went down to 0 CCF, no usage at all, well, then your bill increase is going to be 35% because that's how much we're increasing the fixed charge. So that's the relationship that I want you to be aware of as you're making these recommendations for the board.
In other words, you're shifting more of the revenue requirement onto the low use customers versus.
Right.
That's what happens with this. That's correct.
So Tom, I have a question. You made a comment about the industrial users that will just conserve, right? But they would benefit from this.
So they would benefit, but they also would at the same time, if they're like, well, you know what, there's not enough financial incentive for us to go make this investment into this conservation measure. So we're not going to do it. And then everybody else's rates get somewhat predictable. I don't know how much you guys use this in the industry at all anymore, but it used to be used quite a bit, the death spiral, and which I know is a bit fictional. But
it's real.
But I mean, there was I think it was the City of Industry or somewhere down south, City of Irvine, somewhere in California. They got themselves caught in this kind of do loop where conservation was really important. So they put a really strong conservation message out there, which I would argue we have a really strong conservation message in our price rates right now. The public responded, said, okay, we're going to cut back on their use. And they did a lot. And all of a sudden they were in trouble from a revenue perspective. So the board was faced to, well, we got to raise rates. They raised rates, sent a stronger conservation signal. And it just kind of kept going until the board all got voted out and this person got, that my position got fired and, obviously I don't want any of that. But,
So,
but that's a bit of an extreme case. We're not facing that, but the point is that yes, if you put more emphasis towards the fixed cost, you are then sending a signal that isn't as strong as it is today on conservation. Doesn't mean you don't have a conservation signal. It's just less than what it is today. That's why you see that savings. The more you're using, you're saving money because you're softening that message about conservation. That's what that in essence is what you're doing.
I would be interested because I think if I remember correctly, the number was 9,000 of your customers that would need the customer assistance program. So how many more people with this increased fixed rate are we pushing off the edge? That would be a number that would be.
And that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma.
Right.
I think that's a fair, that's why.
Because I mean, at some point in time, the honest to God truth is this, customer assistance program, we're all paying for that.
Right.
So I just assume not pay for any more people that we,
Right.
So how do you balance
The
that?
number of people who would qualify probably stays the same because it's based on the income demographic
Right.
rather than the bills. But the amount that you're going to have to provide in relief would probably go up,
Right.
in which case your program becomes
Which means
bigger.
the rest of us are all paying more.
That's right.
Right.
It is a.
Is there a way to do this without shooting yourself in the foot with the conservation message?
No.
Commissioner Dunn, I think there is. Commissioner Dunn, I think there is. I mean, I think most of conservation is about
Yeah.
communications and reaching out and providing incentives to customers. We like to think that people react to the price of water. To be honest with you, most people don't know what they pay for water. If I tell you what the rate is and I use the word CCF, how many of you think of 748 gallons of water? I mean, it's an abstraction. So the conservation message is more a function of how we, hesitate to use the word marketing, but how we present it and how we pursue that. So I think we can, I don't think we need to walk away from conservation. In fact, I don't think we can legally. So we can do both. Impact on customers is kind of a different question than the one that you raised. So I think that's really the focus. I think we can make it on the conservation side just simply by maintaining emphasis, pursuing things like AMI, some other things we can do that will incentivize conservation or facilitate.
Yeah, to be clear, we're not saying conservation isn't important. Even if we did get to 30%, right? You still have 70% of your revenue is tied to a conservation message. So conservation is still an important signal. The question is, do you make a change here to say a little additional rate stability is a good idea to get or not? Maybe it's not enough, but that's the question we're trying to pose.
So we have a question in the chat.
Yep, we have two online. The first is a comment and a question within it, I believe. The issue with this is as we conserve less, we will need more capacity in the future, which means that we would be having this discussion again. And then the other question was, can you speak more about our legal obligations to keep in line with conservation style billing?
So maybe I can talk to the billing side. I don't think we have a legal obligation to maintain our rate structure. There is an emphasis, or historically it's been emphasis in Oregon on having block rate structure. But a lot of utilities have not pursued that and have still met their requirements in their water management conservation plan. So I don't think we have any legal jeopardy there at all. We're doing enough and we will continue to do a sufficient amount to maintain our water rights and everything.
Jenna, can you repeat the first question?
The first question was concern over whether or not this really de-incentivized conservation. And the concern was that as we conserve less, we would need more capacity in the future. So we would be in a position in the future to have this discussion again.
We have a long runway before we will. So we have a lot of capacity that we're bringing on with the Willamette. Now, I'm not saying we walk away from conservation, but if we were to lose some conservation impact, it would take a lot of years before that would manifest itself in a need for additional capacity. And of course, we're going to maintain our conservation program, I think. Tom, do you want to add something?
Well, yeah, I mean, to be clear, as I said before, the conservation message isn't going away. When 70% of our revenue is tied to usage, there's still a very strong signal there that, hey, you use your water wisely. We're also making investments in other aspects of water conservation. There's another place too, when we do our water master planning, we kind of look at conservation as another pump.
Resource.
It's another way. So we may find, hey, the best way to use your dollars here in the future, this is why we update our master plans about every 5 years. You constantly look at how things change and you say, well, you know what? It makes a lot of sense for us to purchase it, to incentivize you to use less water. We're going to actually pay you to do that. So that in Nevada makes a whole lot of sense where they're truly water starved, right? So they're willing to pay you instead of having to go pursue another source. They'll pay you to use less, right? So it's that kind of message that you do, and it's a constant thing that we evaluate as part of our master planning efforts. Every 5 years or so, we update that. And it's a question we have to ask ourselves and look at, say, what's the alternative supply here? And what's it cost to get that versus purchasing it from customers?
Any additional online questions? Okay, thanks everyone.
We've heard there's concern that with inflation, how do you measure inflation? How will people continue to afford their water, especially if this would shift the revenue burden to the lower usage customers, which are many times lower income customers? And then how many more people would be looking to access customer assistance or would need more assistance with this shift? And then how do you
So this is about the conservation message.
and then, so how does this impact the conservation messaging? Will people continue to conserve or not conserve?
I have a concern with this. I have two concerns. First one is looking at the residential side, actually looking at all three, 17, 18, and 19 slides. Looks like the higher users are being supported by the low end users. And I'm wondering if it's time that we separate residential, commercial, and industrial fixed fees.
Yeah, so that was the comment that I made at the end of the commercial slide there that says this is all assuming that we don't really do anything with rate restructuring in a really sort of pervasive way. But to your point, restructuring the rates more comprehensively could be a way to try to address some of that.
Because it feels like going down this road, we're going to have the highest users funding the lowest. The lowest users will be funding the highest users across the board.
So to put it in perspective, when we looked at this in 2012, and we made a move like that, we actually did weight the changes in the fixed charges to take into account what you're describing, Chris. We literally did that. We looked at that too, because again, we were trying to match that fire protection cost. And larger customers put a lot of demand on our fire protection costs. So they ended up picking up a large percentage. And we restructured the fixed charges so they were consistent with that higher fire demand. So something like that could be part of this.
I mean, a Nike or an Intel could simply pick up and say, we're going to build a plant somewhere else where we can get the water cheaper and have a nice, they could do a Tesla. So they literally picked up 4,000 employees and moved to another state.
Yep.
We had a comment. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jen.
Just wanted to share a comment for tracking. One of our RAC members noted that they thought it was a good idea to have the 3 customer types billed differently.
Introducing a third block is also an option for the high users. You could reduce the first block even more for the low users, but still increase the fixed charge. What I've seen is there's been some people that just use a lot, but it's a small percentage, but the volume's massive from the water utilities I've done. in the different area.
Is that a common option?
It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to match the cost of service, the fact is that, you know, again, those block thresholds would need to be based on something having to do, not just total amount of water they use, but when they use it, they're peaking. And our large, the bottom line is our large industrial customers take a lot of water at a fairly constant rate, even Nike does with their irrigation. They take a lot of water at a fairly constant rate, and they manage that pretty carefully right now. They're not just worried about their water bill, they also worry about their sewer bill, which can be as important to them as their water bill. Because once they take the water from us, they got to give it back to Clean Water Services and pay the VIG there. Did I say that?
Not out loud.
So in any event, you know, it's a tough world. So they've done a lot to manage there. And they will continue to do what's in their business interest. There's no doubt about it. That's their job.
Did you have something else to add, Jason?
No.
Okay.
So Jason, Paul, I've asked you guys this before, and I think I know the answer, but I'll ask again anyways, just see if your answer changed. Within the industry, I know you tried to find a metric out there to say, hey, here's the normal range. Here's the, you know, kind of an industry standard, you know. Have you found anything in that regards?
Yeah, so the not an industry standard, and I think it varies quite a bit depending on where you are. So the one that I think I told you about, Tom, was, you know, in California, they have a best management practice that if your fixed charges cover at least 30% of your cost, you're deemed to have been sort of in a safe harbor from their conservation practice. Now, some of those utilities are funded with a mill levy, property taxes, ad valorem property taxes, and that kind of messes up that stuff. But in a sense, that is one metric that in California, that 30% is deemed to be sort of a safe harbor from a conservation perspective. But I don't think that I would say that 30% is a typical amount or an average amount. Some places are higher and some are lower.
Now, I don't know if it's in there now, but the American Water Works Association Manual M1, which is the sort of Bible for all this rate making jargon, used to say that 30% of your costs are, well, no, but I want to make sure I say this right. They said no more than 30% of your rate should come from these fixed charges at one point. And I chair that committee right now, and we're rewriting the M1 as I speak at this moment. And I've continued to ask this group of authors to cite chapter and verse where that came from. Our agency has been around since 1954, and a lot of this stuff is legacy rules of thumb that a bunch of old timers put in there, and they never supported it with anything. But that 30%, I think, is still in that book. And so you hear that in the industry, like, oh, we want to get, you know, no more than 30% out of these fixed charges, but nobody knows where it came from. And I would agree with Paul. If you go across the country, and I've had the opportunity to do that, these charges range a lot from 0% fixed charge. And I've got some clients who just collect 100% of all their revenue from usage charges to very high amounts, you know, 50, 60, 70% coming from fixed charges in some cases. So it can definitely range. Is there a recommendation out there? I wouldn't use that 30% from the M1 manual because, like I said, I have no idea where that source of information ever came from to begin with.
Probably came from the same place.
But when I'm designing rates for our clients, what I like to do is we follow some rules of proportionality in all of this. And I know the district is doing this too, is you're looking at things like the fixed costs that have to do with running your operation, the billing system, this building, the people in it, the management overhead. These are the kinds of things that don't have a whole lot to do with water usage. They have to do with having customers. And those kinds of things, I like to design into fixed monthly charge because that's the closest approximation to proportionality that I can get from that. When it comes to parts of the system, like the water itself and the capacity, I like to design that into the usage charges because we can apportion that based on usage pretty well. And that means that we can achieve better that intra-class equity that Paul was talking about before. So it gives you a mechanism for scaling the amount of cost that any one particular customer is picking up. So where that falls out in every case, for me, it's been all over the place. Sometimes those fixed charges are a lot.
So is 30% a laudable goal, like an interim goal?
I'm not sure it's a laudable goal or, I mean, I think it's not a financial goal necessarily. It really is one of the values of the community.
Right.
I think we need to have that conversation. So when we,
So what we've got now is pretty unreasonable. I mean, that's my view of it. And we need to move somewhere. And the issue is how far and how fast. And I guess that's what I'm looking to this group to advise the board on, which is, okay, we need to get to 60% in 10 years. Or for 30%, 60, that was a Freudian slip.
Way ambitious.
Now, you've got to be careful with this because when I was in the city of Portland in 2000, we switched the whole thing around. We dumped the fixed charges and put everything on the volume charges. And big users just freaked out. I mean, in Oregon's Health Sciences bill went up by $1 million a year. And of course, they're a 2-year budget cycle, like everything else in the state. They're surprised, here's your new water bill. And then the billing system didn't work, so we couldn't tell them what it was. But it's gonna get big. So I just, where are we going? How fast do we need to get there? And I think that's all wound up in this, in what we're doing. I mean, it bothers me that the low users are getting hit harder. But on the other hand, I don't see a way out of that.
Well, and what I was saying before, my concern, believe it or not, is actually for the low water user because they have the least amount of ability to respond.
Yes.
Right? They don't, if their bill gets too high, unlike a Nike, unlike an Intel, they don't have the resources to go reinvest in anything. They don't have it. So they're just stuck with then if the big user starts to drastically change their behavior, they're stuck with results. Now we could meet again. We can, if that were to happen, we could then say, okay, well, now that's really changed the equation here. Now we want to relook at this whole issue of what is affordable, how are we going to deal with the low income, that kind of thing. That'd be another way to do it.
but I think we need to have, so if we're looking at the policy and the goals of the policy, we need to have a sober assessment of that because, I mean, I'm not as concerned as Tom, obviously, in terms of the fixed charges. And I'm looking at within 5 years, some of our fixed costs are literally fixed, like debt service. It isn't going to respond to inflationary pressures,
Right.
and that we're going to have this phenomenon that occurs. So I don't want to do anything drastic right now while we're trying to get at the final stretches of financing the program. And once we kind of get at altitude and get some smooth air, then we will have an opportunity to restructure this. But I'm not sure that we are going to incentivize or disincentivize conservation much. The fact is, and I hate to say it this way because it sounds horrible, but Intel isn't going to say, we're done here, we're moving. They might invest, but again, they're doing that because their water and sewer bills right now. If there's a way to make money, their job is to do it, and they're doing a good job at their job. So, I mean, I don't think we that we'll see that necessarily. And if we are going to see it, we're going to see it regardless. And so this really comes down to a question of, is this the time that we do it? And if so, what other things from the customer experience should the board consider and ponder? I think that that's really the question. And we've heard some ideas here. One would be a third block. We could look at that. One would be the fixed charges that are weighted, kind of like what we did in 2012. Or the other one is the status quo, I guess. I don't know what the options are, but I think that's where we need to get some feedback from this group is where do we want to go with that? But I don't want to give you a sense that we're teetering on the edge of
No, and I don't even,
sustainability here.
no, but I also want to point, 2019 and 2020 both were scary years for different reasons. One, 2019 was a wet summer. 2020 with COVID, so we had this back-to-back phenomenon that was that's when it got unnerving, and that's where I'm like, we can't afford a lot of those. And with climate change, these other, I have no control over that. That's the stuff that scares me, is when we have back-to-back events and not just a one-year anomaly. That's when they start getting a little more uncomfortable.
And the back-to-back ones we have been positive ones.
Most of the ones, unfortunately, not during all of my tenure. So.
So circling back to the committee and your lived experience that you bring to the group, has the expertise, is there anything else anyone would like to add about what impacts to the residential ratepayers customer experience should the board consider as they're considering the rate structure? Is there anything else that's coming to mind that we haven't talked about tonight?
I might have missed it because I think this is my second meeting, but I'm so used to in these conversations seeing the graph that shows where every other city in the metropolitan area is, because that's how we do things, right? We're going to raise the rates. We're going to be over here. Everybody else is going to raise their rates, and then everybody wants to be in the middle, right? So do we have a sense? And because you're a special district, maybe you don't play that same game?
No, we played the same game.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Good to know.
all utilities do.
I'll just say it's a bad game to play, but yes.
Yeah.
Right, but everybody does it. So you don't want to sit on the sidelines.
Sure, and I can pull something up here in a bit. Maybe I can manage to get it on the screen. I don't know if I'll be able to, but let me pull that up so you can see what that is.
I don't know if anybody else is interested in it, but you can do it offline.
Yeah, I'll try to pull that up because we do have that information.
The reason why I say it's a bad game to play is at every entity is at a different point in their investment cycle, right? So the classic example Paul uses all the time is, was it 20 years ago, Wilsonville was at the top. They were by far off the charts. They're now at the bottom because they made that big investment 20 years ago. Guess where we're at? We're approaching the top because we're making this huge investment. 20 years from now, we're going to probably look like,
because our debt service won't go up with the rate of inflation.
Yeah, we're going to be like, wow, oh my God, TVWD is the model of, so it's where you're at in your investment cycle.
Yeah. Well, I resonate with that because Tiger is sort of towards the top right now, but it's because we made all our investments.
We're going to
Couple
beat you
years.
here in a bit.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that. It'll make my job easier. But I guess from the customer experience, like narrowly focus on this question, I guess I feel sort of the same way as Paul in the sense that it contradicts the affordability thing that we're talking about. But if we were to change the fixed and the variable, the sort of like the winners and the losers in that situation, the losers are the people who might want to do something about the change in their bill. The consumption change might go from 4 CCF to 3 CCF. That's not going to impact the district that much. And then those folks that are the big users, they're going to see a decrease in their bill without changing their consumption or their conservation efforts now. So I'm not sure you're going to see like this exodus in commercial and industrial. But when it comes to customer experience, what I worry about is like, what is the perception
impact to customers and at what cost when you're only gaining like what, a 1% revenue benefit in those sort of situations. So like your trade-off in revenue stability or like being more risk averse, but at like what cost to like your trust with the community and with customers. And so it seems like something you do incrementally or over time or after your debt service comes on and you can articulate to them how stagnant your fixed costs will be. So that's more of my concern when it comes to the customer experience than actually like the conservation. Like conservation isn't something I worry about with the shift necessarily.
Katie, can I put something on the screen there? And I don't know if it'll show on that screen unless you are showing the Teams meeting. So I will share because I found the information that you were asking for. The people online, I think will see it, but if you can bring the Teams meeting over to that screen, you may have to hit escape out of your PowerPoint. And then go down and choose the Teams. There it is. It's right there. So this shows, again, for our, can you make that a little bit bigger somehow? I don't know how to do it. Yeah, just maybe maximize that. But I'll just point for now.
All you need to make yours full size.
It is.
Oh.
Yeah, it's full size. So these are the volume charges for a 7 CCF customer for the various other utilities. And these are the fixed charges that they have. This information is a little bit old. You can see the dates there. This is some we put together last summer when the board was considering those rates. So they're within 6 to 12 months. And you can see that where TVWD is proposed, which is now actual. That was the proposal at the time, and how we've let you off the hook there.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other thing that this graph presents that I agree with Tom is that it almost suggests that you want to be down here. And in reality, we have a responsibility to invest in the infrastructure, et cetera. And you can't will the end without willing the means. And so it puts us in kind of this odd perspective where now we don't want to be up here. This is a generational investment. We really don't have any choice. We're going to build the Willamette. It's going to be here for a few years, and then we'll start to work down the list. But literally, Wilsonville, back when they built the Willamette River Water Treatment Plant, we were their partners in that. They were at the top of the list 20-some years ago. And Tigard, and I actually did some of that work for you back in the days. Yeah, for the high fixed charges time.
Thank you for doing that. I
I'll
appreciate
put
it.
that back down so we can get back to the presentation.
So shifting gears to our input needed question, can we get a feel from this group? How do you feel about adjusting the structure of the rate?
Katie, we had one comment online noting that there was a feeling of being against the increase in the fixed rate and in favor of the increase in variable charge. And the person who commented noted that they do understand that this would result in less predictable revenue, but they are not in favor of the change. Does anyone else online want to share whether they're in favor or against? We have someone typing as well. It seems like the approach of increasing fixed charges is a foregone conclusion. It was said that it's just a question of how far, how fast. What are we being asked?
I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think we're looking for some feedback to understand, to give the board perspective.
Right. Great, thank you for clarifying that. The comment continues, it seems like it's a bad deal for conservation as well as penalizing low usage customers, which includes low income, while rewarding industrial customers. And then another comment notes, customers should be billed differently based on 1, impact / use of infrastructure, and 2, normal average use of water. It makes sense to me to break out the billing structure to 3 categories: 1, residential multifamily, 2, commercial, and 3, industrial. And as more comments roll in, we'll continue to share those.
In this space, this is general. Our folks don't need to drag on. We talked about this at length, but we want to do a show of hands of those that are in favor of adjusting the structure and maybe go from there. Is there anyone who feels that adjusting the structure and increasing the fixed rate would be beneficial for the district?
I actually feel like you don't have enough information. There were other methodologies that were suggested, and I'd be interested just to see how that modeled and what that looked like, as opposed to, one way or the other.
What I was going to say is that any kind of, whether we move up or down, that if we properly, exclusively, and thoroughly explain it to the customers, I would be in favor of justifying a fixed charge change. But we can't just say, costs have gone up. What I'm thinking here is detail. Why have costs gone up? Why do we have to increase a fixed charge? And it's inevitable that, things are costing more and water is going to cost more as well.
Sure.
But justification should be paramount as far as the customer is concerned. So I'd be in favor of, providing we can justify that as to why.
When is the next cost of service analysis?
Well, depends. I was hoping to do that after we're done with the one. We could accelerate that. That was the recommendation of this group.
I'm just curious because a lot of like the concerns around one, like industrial really being a big winner and residential being a big loser, like that's the point of a cost of service analysis, is that you look at the factors, like the peaking factors or consumption patterns, so that you put them in your costs into those buckets. And so it helps alleviate some of that where it's like, oh, the residential is just getting hit hard. Well, that's the point of that exercise. And so, but what it will also do is if their fixed costs change dramatically, like with debt service, that will also kind of get reallocated in one of those. And so you may see a shift in fixed and variable as a result of that. Now, timing, it would have to be after some of that debt was issued and those costs were known. But I'm curious to know how much that would shift just as an outcome of that analysis, rather than us trying to make a recommendation about what we think.
I think what we would need to do that would be, obviously there's a policy component to it, and then we would take that policy component and we would do an analysis that would generate a cost-based rate consistent with that policy. So there's a bit of a kind of give us direction what to do, and then we can go out, work the technical analysis and bring that back. But that, as you would indicate by doing a cost service study, that is a pretty significant project we'd undertake, and it's frankly about time we do something like that. It's a very reasonable proposal request, I believe.
And it's not something you did like last year.
No.
Okay.
We look at it, we do look at these things from a is it still okay basis, but we don't do what if we wanted to change these things? So we're trying to get the ideas from this group as to what things we should be working on, and then we can go out and issue an RFP and say, these are the things that we want to refine. And the constraint is that we would still want it to be fair and some of the other criteria that we have. Yeah.
All that was supported online. The comment was that they love the idea of looking at the most recent cost of service to understand the true cost to each customer category, and an interest in customers by category paying their fair share.
And I don't know if I made this point clear enough as we went through. So TVW's rate structure, by having an ex-use rate structure in a sense, with the exception of the single-family residential customers, which are deemed to be in one class. Everybody's kind of in their own unique class because the block threshold is based on their average, based on a percentage of their average annual use, which is tied back to the district's underlying cost structure. So now, I think if we did a cost service analysis, we would ask ourselves the question, is that rate design still relevant? We have a new billing system. Would we apply an excess use rate to everybody? Should there be some other approaches taken that might make more sense? And so I think we would look at it in a broader perspective as opposed to just kind of tweaking on one end.
Before we move on, is there anyone else who'd like to share their feedback on whether or not the district should change its rate structure to recover more costs from the fixed charges? Jenna, anyone online?
No, no additional comments at this time online, but I will continue to monitor the chat for anyone who wishes to leave a comment, and we will archive them and add them to the minutes for this meeting.
I do want to have more comment. I know there's a committee member here that is probably not present, but he's represents a Better Business Bureau, one of those business entities. That's what I've not heard other than we were talking about. So to kind of go down this direction, I'm thinking we might want to hear from the other billing class.
So I think we have a rep here that replaced him. Okay. Oh.
I'm with the chamber.
Oh, okay. I'm
Washington
sorry.
County Chamber, yeah. Which is why I asked him the question about the business.
Okay.
I mean, business loves certainty, you know, these kinds of things create sort of uncertainty. So, and we have to have a conversation with the business community about what's proposed. And now that we have a good flavor of that, then I can come back with a more informed perspective of what they're feeling about that.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Up next, we're going to a preview of the customer assistance program.
I'm back on.
Back up.
Well, I better hurry up about this, got like 18 minutes. I know, I can't hardly remember what I did yesterday, let alone last month, but we're gonna have to do a little recap here about where we just were a month ago when we talked with you last. Anyone remember this slide? Okay, we got one hand up, that's enough for me. We went through 3 hypothetical concepts of customer assistance programs to get a sense from you about which one of these more or less fit your ideal about what you would feel comfortable proposing to the board. All of this, we had first concept, which was a fixed percentage discount from the total water bill. The second one was a fixed dollar discount based on the number of household members. And the third one was also a fixed discount from the water bill. The difference between the first and the third one was how we built it rather than the nature of the program. You'll probably remember that all of these were based off of the same income qualification level. This was the low income, can't never remember what the H stands for, but it's the electric assistance program. And that basically is about 60% of the Oregon median household income, which defines whether or not you can qualify for the program or not. It was the most generous of the ones we looked at. So it included more people than any of the other measurements that we could have used. And we talked about how do we recover all the program costs. In all 3 cases, it was from all customers rather than just a subset. And we also, and by the way, those were all based on feedback that we've got from the previous workshops. And then how we collect those program costs. Remember the 80-20 number? We've been talking about this. So 80% of it was going to come from the volumetric charges and 20% from fixed. By the way, if we change that, it would probably be 70-30, right? So something to think about. So we did some polling after that, if you want to hit the next slide. And when we did that polling, we got a lot of what we thought might be consensus around concept 1, about 80%, something like 20% liked that idea of fixed dollar amount for each member of the household. Nobody really cared about that third one. That third one was really based on a survey that the district had done of its customers that said, how much would you support a customer assistance program if you had to pay out of your pocket, per month? And they came up with an answer of $2 to $2.50 a month. And that's how we built that one up. But nobody seemed to care for that one too much. Okay, so what we think we're going to be doing, based on your concurrence here tonight, is going back to the board here in our 6th workshop and ultimately with our report to the board that's going to say, hey, we want to go with concept number 1 with some of the following considerations woven into this. One, that the program should be equitable for larger households. And we think that's achievable with the percentage discount from the total bill. So you can understand that a larger household is probably going to have more water use, more people, more water use. And we discount 30% from that bill versus 30% from a smaller bill to begin with. We're still getting a household size consideration and all of that. So we do think that that's doable with that kind of approach. Second, level of discount should reduce the risk of water shutoffs. We also think that that is going to happen with really any of those programs, but with the concept number 1 also, that we would expect that if you qualify and if you participate and do those things and get the discount, that the shutoffs that the district experiences will be less than what we've had before. And by the way, if it's not, and we're seeing that it's not working, then that's going to indicate to the district that they need to do more outreach to make sure we get more people who are actually participating in the program, or it could indicate that the amount of aid that's being provided needs to increase as well. And those are all things that the board can do and will be able to do when they need to. Number 3, I'm sorry, we're still going here. The program funding should be right-sized for and affordable for ratepayers. That's just what I was saying. So we've got some ideas going into it about what that program sizing probably looks like based on the percentage discounts that we've talked about. That's probably the initial program that the district offers. As this gets reevaluated on a frequent basis, the board may well adjust the level of the aid that's being provided. And can make other adjustments to the program to make sure it's responsive to the community needs. We heard from you that water conservation is an important part of this, but it shouldn't be a driver for the customer assistance program. So we're not really looking to drive this conservation message home with a customer assistance program. The program funding should be adaptable to the participation each year. So what that essentially means is how much should the district be budgeting for this from one year to the next? And as they're looking at the numbers from the program size and the participation levels, that they're going to have to make that adjustment into their budget. And that would be a requirement on the board and staff to make sure that that happens. So those are all things that we took away from our discussion in the last couple of workshops that we think will be woven in there. Are there other items that we wanted to ask you here tonight before we kind of go forward with this and put this into context for the board? Are there other items that you would like to see addressed with this concept to support your recommendation at our March meeting? And so I want to be real careful about how we say this. This is what we believe we've heard from you, and we're trying to put this into a recommendation for the board. As a group, with the staff and with the other consultants who are working on this thing, we think we've got this. But right now is the opportunity for you to say, no, you didn't. You totally missed the point. We need you to change this, this, and this, or you need us to do something different, because I'm real sensitive about this. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but there are a lot of you, and we're trying to capture all of these ideas into one sort of cohesive thing. So if you want to, I'm going to just be quiet, take a step back and start taking some notes. You guys tell us whether you think we got this right.
And Jay, and just to your point, you also have, I don't know, a month to kind of contemplate that. So maybe some of you are looking at this going, I'm not sure why I chose that. And so this is that opportunity to say that, and, help us understand, not just, is this your direction, but is there something else you want us to look at, maybe to help clarify the direction you want to take on this?
Volunteers?
Well, I'm just going to mention that it makes sense to be equitable, simply because, you're dealing with reality here where people can say they're using more but paying less, as opposed to I'm using less and paying more type of a thing. So I'm always for that equitable justification. Conservation again is big. Need to also address that. Whatever we do, it ought to be, as I've said before, is some kind of educational, informative process for the public and the customer to be able to see that we're not just picking numbers from somewhere. That'd be my take. That that I like this plan because we can, we can talk apples to apples. We can talk people seeing something in reality that the costs are fixed. Therefore, this is what you have to pay. And I think that if we can justify that, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I think it's so high level, honestly. I have a hard time buying off of India. Because if I was gonna try to model this through your business model, I mean, the reality is sitting here for a couple hours over 5 months, there's no way that most people can do it. And I actually have some background in this kind of stuff, not utilities, but finance. So broad picture, it sounds good. What does it really mean? I don't know. And how many, I was asking a question, I don't know if I ever got the answer. What percentage of people who consume water get a bill? There's that expression from maybe the first week, Paul, we had behind the wall or behind this, whatever. There's some expression, say, that you use, say that there's a whole bunch of people we don't see. I don't know what that number is.
Well, we can get to that number.
And I asked that, Andrew, I sent that about a month ago to the team asking for some clarification on it.
Come up with something pretty quick. Just a rough estimate, Steve, I'll get you some right now.
I think that has to do with the multifamily.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. That is a hard thing to answer. It is really challenging.
I know that. And I'm not critical of it.
Yeah.
I'm simply saying if it's 30% of your target population,
Right.
I'm not an economist. What is the proportion of people under a federal income level that are renters versus homeowners? I don't know the answer to that question. Sort of intuitively, I'm going, well, I'm thinking maybe there's more income challenges for people who are renting than owning, but I don't know that for a fact.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important piece. So if you came back to me and said, well, I got 30% of our population that I can't even begin to address, and that population may actually be the most at need.
So just Brent's numbers, probably close to about 35%.
My guess.
But having said that, now keep in mind that, again, those most in need that are going to be in the multifamily situation,
Right.
many of them are going to have other housing subsidies that cover the rent and cover their water, their utility bill as part of that. And we talked a little bit about how rent is a surplus, et cetera, that there's let's not rehash all that, but
yeah,
your point is excellent. Right now, I can't tell you what percentage of the people are going to participate and how much they're going to qualify for because we don't have that experience. But we have to, I feel if we're going to have a program, we're going to have to start somewhere, develop that data set as we go along, or else we'll just never get a program launched.
Well, you have a program in the sense that if someone calls up and says, hey, I'm really struggling, there is a program.
Well, we have an emergency assistance program, which during COVID, we've changed a bit, but it's essentially once per year. So it's not a systemic, once per year. And there are other restrictions on that, or they can make payment arrangements. But at some point, we're going to have to pivot back to more standard operating procedure where we are unfortunately going to have shut off customers who don't pay their bill. And at that point, then we really have to have a program for those who simply cannot pay their bill.
Right.
We have some comments in the chat. With one of our members is a housing provider and they bill back water, sewer, trash, and many other housing providers do the same. They have approximately 40 to 45% renters in the greater Portland metro. So there was just a comment to give some context there.
Hi, this is Jesse. I made the comment about being a housing provider. So, I attend industry meetings all the time. I've been in the industry for 15 years. And in the Portland Metro, about 40 to 50% of the population are renters. That includes multifamily and single family, although multifamily is much heavier than single family rentals. We bill back usually between 60 to 75% of our water sewer costs and deduct a common area deduction. It's pretty rare that people aren't able to pay their water sewer bill. There's a lot of nonprofits out there. We usually recommend to our renters to call 211 when they can't make payments to see if there's a resource out there. But I would guesstimate that there's probably at any given time somewhere from, you know, 0.5% up to 1% that have trouble paying their water, sewer, garbage bills in most of my apartment communities. I have a small portfolio of only 2,000 units, but it's spread around the Portland Metro and the suburbs. So just thought I'd give that information to the group.
And Jesse, I think your information is actually not, it's not as inconsistent as some of ours. When I did that calculation for you, Steve, I was including single family, and you're right, some single family are renters, I was excluding that. And TVWD tends to have a bigger percentage of single family homes than even, for example, the city of Beaverton. A lot more apartments in Beaverton than there are in the unincorporated parts where we are. We have a lot of apartment complexes, but 35%, it's probably in that range, somewhere between 30 to 40%, be my guess.
Are there any items with concept one that anybody wants to make recommendations?
Right, so our next meeting is March 21st. We will continue to discuss and develop the recommendations in this group. We have heard from a couple of you that you may not be able to attend in March, so we have an online forum that we can email out to the group if you'd like to provide your input prior to the meeting so that we can incorporate that in the recommendation. So we will go ahead and email that out. I don't think we have any members of the public. Jenna, is there any public comment?
We do have some non-members on the line, so we'll just pause for a moment. Is there any public comment? Going once, going twice. Okay. There is the comment form available through the RAC website as well, and so you can leave public comment there. Thanks so much.
Here, we will send them online, and it will be the same program of dinner at 5:30, and we'll thank you all so much. Does anyone have any objection to the minutes or any edits that need to make to the minutes? Hearing none, we just get a show of hands for approval for the meeting minutes meeting report. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Our meeting is adjourned.
Yeah. My boxing days are Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Okay,
Right around.
okay.